The eating house in Whiskey Bend sat at the settlement's ragged edge like a wounded animal too stubborn to die. Oil lamps swung from bent nails, throwing amber light across plank walls blackened by decades of grease smoke and neglect. The air hung thick with the smell of burnt bacon fat, stale whiskey, and something harder to name, the particular bitterness that seeped from men who had abandoned both soap and conscience. A poker-faced miner scraped his tin spoon against an empty bowl, the metallic screech deliberate enough to make teeth ache. Two farmhands paused mid-chew, jaws slack, staring at the center table with the fascination men reserved for public hangings. A woman in faded calico pulled her shawl tighter and edged toward the door without finishing her meal. Nobody spoke. The room held its breath. At the center table sat Lakota. He was Lakota, 24 years old, lean as winter, and twice as unforgiving. His shoulders were broad beneath a hide shirt, decorated with his mother's quillwork, intricate blue and white beadwork that told stories his people understood without words. His hair hung in a single thick braid wrapped with red trade cloth, and one eagle feather marking him as an emissary, not a warrior. But the war bonnet resting beside his plate made every white man calculate distances to exits. The bonnet was magnificent and dangerous, a circle of white-tipped eagle feathers, each earned through witnessed courage. Wearing it here in a mining town that ground Indians into unmarked graves as casually as it crushed ore was either the highest bravery or deepest madness. Lakota knew which. That was why he wore it. He had come under federal promise of safe talk arranged by Indian Agent Cornelius Hale. The bonnet was not pride. It was insurance, visible proof that could not be forgotten if violence came. If they killed an emissary wearing ceremonial regalia, even Whiskey Bend would face consequences. Beside him sat his daughter, Wapia. 9 years old, small but fierce in ways that had nothing to do with size. Her arms folded tight across her chest, shoulders squared against a wind only she could feel. She wore a deerskin dress her grandmother had stitched, and her hair was parted straight and braided with the same precision her father used crafting arrows. She did not eat. She watched the room like a scout watching enemy ground. The door creaked open. A one-legged woman entered. She balanced on a crutch and a crude prosthesis, leather strips, and carved pine lashed together with bootlaces in desperation. The wooden leg knocked against floorboards, with each step a hollow thud that turned every head. Her dress was the gray that came from too many washings, with harsh lye dust ground into every seam. Her hair, once blonde, hung limp beneath a shapeless bonnet. A bruise circled her wrist, purple, fading to yellow, so the unmistakable mark of rope. Her name was Dorothea Schmidt. 28 years old, though hardship had aged her to 40. 6 months at Copper Gulch Mine did that ground people down, wore them out, used them up. She stopped inside the doorway, breathing harder than the short walk should require. Her eyes swept the room with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to measure threats before they became violence. Every table was full. Every face was closed. The miner turned his back. The farmhand stared at her stump. The woman in calico fled entirely. Dorothea's gaze settled on Lakota's table, the only place where hatred had not yet found voice. She swallowed throat dry and moved toward it. Each step was agony negotiated with will. The prosthesis chafed raw flesh, the crutch dug into her armpit until she felt bruises forming in real time. She stopped at the table's edge, close enough to see water stains on scarred wood, close enough to smell sage and wood smoke on the Lakota man's clothing. She looked at Lakota, then at the solemn child, then back. "Can I share this table?" Lakota studied her without hurry. Not her face first, but her satchel worn leather, bulging awkwardly. Then her stump, visible below her hem, wrapped in bandages overdue for changing. Then her hands scarred in patterns that spoke of industrial accidents and involuntary labor. He said nothing. In a room like this, speaking first invited violence. Wapia leaned forward, her voice clear as breaking glass. "You can sit. My father does not eat with cowards." The room shifted. Chairs scraped. A man adjusted his coat to clear his holstered pistol. Another spat tobacco juice and muttered just loud enough to carry. The atmosphere tilted toward violence like a wagon wheel catching a rut. Dorothea sat anyway. She sat because standing hurt too much, and leaving meant walking back into a town that had decided what to do with women who stole from the company. She lowered herself with a suppressed sound of pain, leaning the crutch against the table and adjusting the prosthesis so the straps would not cut as deep. Her hands trembled, and she folded them in her lap. Lakota did not look at her again. He cut venison with his belt knife, chewed deliberately, and kept his eyes on the room. His peripheral vision tracked every movement, every hand drifting toward a weapon. But he did not move away. He did not tell her to leave. And in Whiskey Bend in 1853, that was as close to protection as the world allowed. Lakota's presence in Whiskey Bend had sharp purpose. Every person in the eating house understood it, even those who pretended otherwise. West of town, beyond Scrub Pine and Alkali Flats, ran the river his people called Mniwakan, sacred water. Not large but reliable. Cold and clear, fed by mountain snowmelt, it had sustained the Lakota camp for generations. In summer, families gathered there to fish, to wash clothes on smooth stones, to let children play in shallows under watchful eyes. Horses drank deep and stood in cool water to escape brutal heat. 2 weeks ago, the river changed. The shift was subtle, a metallic taste the elders noticed immediately, but children ignored until sickness came. Fish floated belly up in quiet pools, gills crusted dark. Horses refused water, stamping nervously and snorting as if death had a smell. Children who drank coughed through nights until they vomited, then lay weak in their mother's arms. The elders tasted the water, rolled it on their tongues, and said nothing. Their silence was louder than accusation. Lakota had ridden in with 2 escorts, Chaska and Hanska veterans of cavalry skirmishes, who knew when to watch windows and when to watch alleys. They remained outside now near the horses, with rifles held casual but ready. A full delegation inside would be seen as provocation, excuse for massacre. Better to let Lakota enter alone, marked by the war bonnet, whose death would carry consequences. The meeting was supposed to be with Indian Agent Cornelius Hale, a federal appointee managing relations between settlers and tribes. Agent Hale was not beloved by either side, but he was not entirely corrupt, rare in a region where corruption was common as dust. He had promised in writing to confront the mine about contamination and summon a federal inspector. Lakota had ridden 2 dangerous days to hold him to that promise. Dorothea had her own desperate reasons for this table. She had come west from Baltimore 6 months earlier on a labor contract, recruited with talk of good wages and clean lodging. Reality was Copper Gulch Mine, a sprawling industrial wound, where men extracted silver and copper from deep, dangerous veins. The mine paid exclusively in company scrip, usable only at the company store, where prices kept everyone in permanent debt. Dorothea had been hired as laundry help and tally clerk, recording ore weights and washing clothes for men who emerged from shafts covered in rock dust and something else. A silvery substance miners called quicksilver. Mercury. She watched them handle it barehanded, watched it spill into wooden amalgamation troughs, watched it glisten before disappearing into sluices that carried wastewater away. Those sluices led to the river. She had not understood the connection at first. Mercury was another incomprehensible aspect of mining, like black powder and timber shoring and constant collapse danger. But Dorothea understood pain, and she had learned to recognize lies told with confidence. The accident took her leg 4 months ago. Bad blasting black powder set wrong in a support tunnel already compromised. The explosion was muffled deep underground, but the collapse shook the entire camp. Dorothea had been carrying laundry past the shaft entrance when ground shifted and rocks came down. She remembered the sound thunder trapped in a barrel, then impact, then nothing. She woke in the company boarding house with her leg gone below the knee stump, wrapped in bandages reeking of whiskey disinfectant. Claude Mercer, the mine foreman, stood over her cot. Men called him Barbed Wire Bill for scars on his knuckles, for how he smiled when causing pain. He told her it was unfortunate tragic. He paid her in scrip after deducting medical care, lost work time, ongoing room, and board laudanum administered without consent. When she tried to leave men in clean boots, found her at the stage station and explained she owed more than she could ever repay. So she stayed, but not quietly. In Whiskey Bend, law belonged to Sheriff Victor Rourke. Those who feared him called him Dark Dave, never to his face. He was large, powerful, with soft-looking hands that were not. He dressed well-black coat, white shirt resisting omnipresent dust, polished boots reflecting lamplight. His Colt revolver sat in an oiled holster, fingers resting near it with relaxed confidence. He was unfailingly polite, spoke in measured tones, and destroyed lives without raising his voice. He did not need courtrooms, only rope and men willing to hold it. The last fragments of conscience belonged to two people. Dr. Edwin Hale, no relation to the Indian agent, was thin, nervous, early 40s, with wire-rimmed spectacles constantly sliding down his nose. He had come west escaping something he never discussed. He treated minors with trembling hands and children with mysterious ailments. His training could not explain sores that would not heal tremors in young hands worsening confusion. He asked questions nobody wanted answered and recorded everything in a leather journal locked in his desk. The other conscience was Lillian Sigrid, the schoolteacher, a Pennsylvania widow who had come west with her husband and stayed after cholera took him. Mid-30s, severe steel-gray hair pulled painfully tight. She fed students from her dwindling pantry when families could not and kept precise records of which children fell sick first. She did not preach morality. She documented facts and waited for them to become undeniable. Dorothea's satchel, resting against the table leg, contained something that could destroy Whiskey Bend's corrupt structure. Inside was a ledger stolen 3 nights ago when the payroll clerk got drunk and left the office unlocked. Dorothea had slipped inside, found it in an unlocked drawer, arrogance as security, and copied the most damning entries by moonlight. The ledger itself was too large to steal, but these pages contained names, dates, mercury purchases listed as refining supplies, payments to officials labeled consulting fees, and most damning a column titled Labor Transfers, listing 14 workers who had vanished. She had taken them because she knew what they meant, even without knowing what to do with such dangerous knowledge. She came to the eating house because the boarding house was watched, the stage station controlled, and she had run out of hiding places. She had seen Lakota through the window, sitting with his daughter, marked and vulnerable, but radiating defiant dignity. And something in her decided to try one final desperate thing before the world closed around her throat. Now she sat across from a Lakota emissary and his fierce daughter, a white woman and an Indian man, in a room full of people who wanted them erased. Lakota glanced at the wall clock running 5 minutes slow, then at the window where daylight drained into bruised purple and red. He checked the door, counted armed men, measured distances to exits. Indian Agent Hale was late. Far too late for innocence. Wapia tugged her father's sleeve and spoke quietly in Lakota. "Ate, he is not coming. This is a trap." Lakota did not answer. His daughter possessed disturbing perception. She was probably right. He glanced at the door once more, allowing himself foolish hope. The hope died when Sheriff Victor Rourke walked through that door. The door swung open hard enough to make hinges shriek. Sheriff Rourke entered with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything his shadow touched. Imposing without being threatening, powerfully built the kind of presence suggesting strength held in reserve. His black coat hung perfectly despite trail dust covering everything else. His white shirt remained pristine. His hat was brushed, clean boots polished to reflection. His gun belt sat comfortably, the Colt looking freshly cleaned. His hands rested easy near the grip, relaxed but ready. He paused inside and smiled, an expression reaching his mouth, but stopping short of his eyes, leaving them cold as river stones in January. Behind came Deputy Fritz, barely 20, with a patchy beard and nervous energy. He carried a rifle, two tight knuckles white on the stock. Behind Fritz came two men wearing no badges, canvas coats, new revolvers in creaking leather. Hired guns. The kind paid in cash that never appeared in records. The eating house went perfectly still. The miner set down his spoon with exaggerated care. The farmhand stopped chewing. Even the lamps seemed to burn quieter. Rourke's gaze swept the room before settling on the war bonnet. He studied it with unreadable expression, then shifted to Wapia. His eyes lingered on the child just long enough to make Dakota's jaw tighten. Finally, he looked at Dorothea. "Good evening," Rourke said pleasantly, like a shopkeeper greeting customers. "Agent Hale sends regrets. Washout near Arrowhead Pass. Made the trail impassable. These things happen." Dakota's eyes narrowed. He gave his word. Safe talk was promised in writing. Rourke shrugged, slow and theatrical. "Roads and promises both break out here, friend. Nature does what it wants. You know how it is." He took one measured step closer. The two hired men spread out with practiced efficiency, one near the front door, one toward the kitchen. Deputy Fritz stayed close to Rourke's rifle barrel, drifting toward the floor, but held ready. Then Rourke looked at Dorothea, and his smile became sharper, colder, a blade honed to its edge. "Miss Dorothea Schmidt, the mining company filed a complaint. Theft of company property. I need you to come with me for questioning." Dorothea's breath caught. She understood with terrible clarity what this meant. Not arrest, not trial. Interrogation about the ledger's location and who had seen it, followed by an unfortunate accident. Another tragic casualty. Dakota shifted subtly, not standing, but repositioning so his shoulder blocked Dorothea without contact. His voice came out flat, stripped of inflection. "She sits at my table. She is under my word and protection." The room exhaled collectively, wind through grass before a storm. Men leaned forward, hands drifted toward weapons, fingers drummed nervously. Someone cleared his throat with deliberate loudness. Wapia's voice cut through the tension like a knife through cloth. "She asked to sit with respect. She is sitting with permission. You do not drag people away like grain sacks or slaughtered animals." A miner laughed a short, ugly bark. Another muttered, "Child needs her mouth washed," loud enough to be heard. The room tilted further toward violence. Rourke held up one hand, and somehow the room paused. He looked at Wapia with something that might be amusement or something darker. "Well-spoken child." Then turning to Dakota, his voice dropped lower, intimate and dangerous. "Dakota, walk away now with your daughter. Take your horses and ride back. Nobody gets hurt tonight. But keep interfering and you will learn how quickly a town forgets inconvenient promises. How quickly assurances become disputed memories." Dakota held Rourke's gaze without blinking, and the silence stretched until it became physical presence in the room, heavy as storm clouds. Outside, Chaska and Hanska spotted movement in the alley. 3 riders appearing from somewhere, moving with quiet coordination of men who hunt humans for money. One carried rope prominently displayed. Another was checking his rifle's percussion caps. Inside, 2 more men entered through the kitchen. They moved smoothly without rush hands loose near holstered revolvers. Ulysses broad-shouldered with a livid scar across his throat. Bruno thinner, wiry nose, broken so many times it sat crooked. Dakota understood the geometry. Too many guns, too confined. His daughter in any line of fire. Starting a shootout would be suicide and pointless. His death would change nothing. Dorothea would still be taken. Wapia would be orphaned. He refused that mistake. Instead, he turned his head, deliberately rotating so the war bonnet caught lamplight and drew every eye. The bonnet was powerful symbolism, and in that moment, it became perfect distraction too significant to ignore. In that breath of diverted attention, Dorothea slid the folded pages deeper into her skirt's hidden lining, a trick learned from months of concealing things from supervisors. She folded fabric over them and tucked the edge into her waistband, all without looking down. Dakota's hand moved casually, appearing almost accidental as it knocked over the table candle. The flame caught, spilled whiskey instantly, a puddle left by a careless drinker. Fire bloomed across the wood, bright and sudden, racing along the grain, and catching a burlap sack left too close. Thick smoke billowed up. People shouted. Someone cursed. A chair toppled. Dakota moved with fluid efficiency. He scooped Wapia up smoothly, pressing her face against his shoulder, and drove toward the door. He used his free arm as a battering ram, shouldering past a farmhand too startled to block effectively. Dorothea lurched up, prosthesis thudding, crutch scraping. She moved as fast as pain and determination allowed, which was nowhere near fast enough. A gunshot cracked with deafening violence. Wood exploded near Dorothea's head, splinters biting her cheek and drawing blood. The impact threw her off balance. She stumbled, barely caught herself on the doorframe, white-hot pain flashing as her stump ground against the socket. Dakota's hand shot out and grabbed her arm. He hauled her forward with enough force to nearly lift her off her feet, not gently, but with the raw urgency that kept people breathing. They tumbled through the door into dark street. Behind them, Rourke's voice cut through chaos, calm as church bells. After them. Bring them back. The street was dark, lit only by scattered lamplight from windows and weak moonlight, tangled in clouds. Dakota's escorts were moving before he cleared the doorway. Chaska, bringing horses forward at a run, Hanska providing cover with his rifle raised. Neither fired. Firing would end negotiation permanently. Dakota set Wapia down and pulled Dorothea toward the nearest alley, a narrow gap between the dry goods store and a boarded saloon. The alley reeked of rotted vegetables and horse urine. Ground was slick with waste. Dorothea's prosthesis slipped. She caught herself on the wall, kept moving. Behind, boots pounded, overlapping shouts. Someone yelled, "Cut them off at the livery." Another voice, "Do not shoot the child unless absolutely necessary." Dakota reached the alley's end and stopped, scanning ahead. Left the livery already blocked by two mounted men. Right, open prairie flat and exposed under moonlight. No cover for 100 yards. Straight ahead, Dr. Edwin Hale's clinic, a modest clapboard building with a lamp burning in the window. Witnesses. A medical man with some conscience. The thinnest shields, butt shields. Dakota grabbed Dorothea's wrist and pulled her toward the clinic. Pain spiked through her stump with every jarring step. She did not complain. Wapia ran alongside, breath quick, but steady, not panicked. They reached the door, and Dakota hammered with his fist, 3 hard strikes rattling the frame. The door opened immediately. Dr. Hale had been watching. His face was pale, eyes wide behind wire-rimmed spectacles, magnifying his fear. Inside, quickly. They stumbled across the threshold, and Hale slammed the door, dropping a wooden bar into crude brackets. It was flimsy, designed for drunks, not armed men. It might buy minutes, perhaps only seconds. Hale looked from Dorothea to Dakota to Wapia. He took a shaking breath, steadied himself, and pointed to the back room. The cellar, behind the herb cabinet, Go now, go. Dakota wasted no time on questions. He moved to the cabinet tall pine that slid aside easily on concealed rails, revealing a trapdoor flush with floorboards. He gripped the iron ring and pulled it open. A ladder descended into darkness. The smell of dried herbs and damp earth rose up. Down, Dakota commanded. Wapia obeyed instantly, her hands sure on the rungs despite darkness. Dorothea followed slowly and awkwardly, the prosthesis catching repeatedly. Dakota came last, pulling the trapdoor shut as fists began hammering on the clinic door. The cellar was cramped, barely 10 feet across earthen walls lined with shelves holding glass jars of dried plants and mysterious powders. A single oil lamp sat unlit. Dakota found matches and lit it, warm light spreading and casting jumping shadows. Above, fists hammered violently. "We know they are inside, Doctor. Open immediately or we come through by force." Dr. Hale's voice admirably steady. "I have patients resting. You cannot force your way into a medical facility. We can do whatever proves necessary." A pause, then something heavy hitting the door with considerable force. Once, twice. The bar held, but the frame groaned. In the cellar, Dorothea leaned against the wall chest, heaving. Her stump throbbed with each heartbeat. She saw fresh blood seeping through bandaging. The prosthesis socket had split badly during their flight, and rough wood inside had scraped raw skin worse than before. Dakota knelt in front of her without asking, movements economical and purposeful. He examined the prosthesis, the blood, the way her hands shook, trying to unbuckle straps. He paused, hands hovering near the buckle, and waited until she managed a small nod. She nodded, swallowing humiliation. He unbuckled the straps with practiced efficiency and considerable gentleness, then lifted the prosthesis free and set it aside with care. The stump looked angry, skin rubbed raw where the socket had ground against scar tissue, inflammation spreading. Early infection, probably. Dorothea bit her lip, tasting copper, and looked away. Dakota studied the damaged prosthesis like a broken tool requiring repair, not a shameful secret requiring polite avoidance. He turned it over, tested the straps, ran his thumb along the splintered socket. Then he stood crossed to the shelves and selected bear grease and soft leather. He worked without ceremony. He heated the grease over the lamp until it softened, then rubbed it into the straps to restore pliability. He drew his belt knife and carved a thin shim from a shelf board, sanding it smooth. He fitted the shim inside the socket to prevent direct contact with bone, then relaced all buckle holes with fresh rawhide, pulling each considerably tighter than before. Dorothea watched his hands throughout, scarred across knuckles, nails short and clean, every movement economical and sure. He worked with intense focus, no wasted motion, no hesitation, no disgust. When he finished, he placed the repaired prosthesis within her reach rather than handing it to her. The gesture preserved dignity, gave her choice. Dorothea gripped the support beam until knuckles went white, breathing through the strange intimacy of being handled, not romantic gentleness, but fierce, practical attention and fundamental respect that felt more vulnerable than tenderness. She fastened the straps with shaking fingers, testing carefully. It was significantly better. Not perfect, but meaningfully better. The socket no longer bit with every movement, and the straps held firm without cutting circulation. She looked up and met Dakota's eyes. Their gazes held. "Thank you." "Truly." Dakota nodded once, small but final. He did not respond with polite phrases because gratitude between them was not social transaction. It was simple recognition. "I see what you endure. I will not waste it." Above them, the pounding stopped. Rourke's voice filtered down, patient as winter. "Very well, Doctor. We will wait right here. They cannot stay down there forever." We have all the time in the world. They remained hidden for nearly 2 hours, time moving strangely in cramped darkness. Dr. Hale eventually descended, moving cautiously, spectacles catching lamplight. He brought a canteen and dried venison wrapped in cloth. He spoke barely above a whisper. They have men positioned. 3 I can see, front, back, side alley, possibly more. Rourke sits on my steps like he is waiting for a scheduled coach. Very patient, very visible. Lakota chewed venison slowly, eyes distant. Patience is his weapon. Time works in his favor. Hale nodded, adjusting his spectacles nervously. That is his method. He never needs speed. Time and isolation are always his allies. Dorothea shifted the repaired prosthesis. Pain had dulled to manageable ache. How long before they force entry regardless? Hale hesitated. If they believe I am actively hiding you, probably soon. If they think I have simply secured my door and retired, they might wait until dawn. Rourke strongly prefers maintaining appearances of legality when possible. Makes everything simpler afterward. Appearances. Wapia said softly, the word carrying surprising bitterness. Hale looked at the 9-year-old, and something cracked in his expression. He reached into his coat and withdrew 2 small glass vials, holding them to the lamplight. The liquids appeared identical at first glance. This first sample was collected from the river upstream of the mine 2 weeks ago, completely clean. He held up the second. This was collected yesterday from downstream past the sluices. Dorothea accepted the second vial carefully. The water looked identical, clear cold. But when she tilted it, she saw faint rainbow sheen clinging to the interior glass. She removed the cork and sniffed. Sharp, metallic tang, subtle but unmistakable. Mercury contamination, Hale confirmed grimly. Not concentrated enough for immediate death, just sufficient to poison gradually over weeks and months. Children fall sick first because they drink more relative to body weight and play in the water longer. Miners who handle mercury directly become sicker faster, but they attribute everything to rock dust inhalation. The town refuses to acknowledge any connection because doing so would require confronting the mine. And that mine is the only thing keeping Whiskey Bend economically viable. Lakota accepted the vial, turning it slowly. My people have known for 2 weeks. The fish know. The horses know. Only white men pretend ignorance is truth. Hale flinched at the accuracy but could not argue. I have been documenting every case. Progressive hand trembling, mouth ulcers that refuse healing, mental confusion and memory loss severe in older miners. Personality changes, all consistent with chronic mercury exposure, but without concrete proof that the mine is deliberately dumping contaminated waste, without testimony from someone with first-hand knowledge. Everything remains merely a country doctor's medical suspicion, easily dismissed. Dorothea reached carefully into her skirt lining and extracted the folded pages. Paper was crumpled and stained some minor tearing, but the copied ink entries remained legible and damning. She set them on the shelf beside the vials with a soft sound that seemed loud in confined space. This constitutes proof. Undeniable. Hale's hands trembled as he read, eyes moving with increasing speed. His face cycled through expressions, pale shock, flushed anger, pale again. When he spoke, his whisper emerged hoarse. Merciful heavens. This is essentially a written confession in permanent ink. Lakota leaned closer, reading alongside. His English was fluent, learned systematically over years from missionaries and traders. He understood perfectly. Substantial bribes paid to Rourke with specific amounts and dates. Mercury ordered under false descriptions. Most damning, that column listing labor transfers, with names corresponding to workers who had vanished, mostly recent immigrants without family whose absence would trigger no investigations. We must deliver this to someone beyond Rourke's influence, Hale said urgently. Someone with actual authority, a federal marshal perhaps. Who? Dorothea challenged. The nearest marshal is 3 days hard riding from here. We would never make it past town limits. The Indian agent, Lakota said. Cornelius Hale, he promised to attend today's meeting. He promised to bring a federal inspector. Hale's expression became pained. He shook his head slowly. There is a rumor. Lillian, the schoolteacher, heard it this morning from a ranch boy delivering eggs. Agent Hale rode out yesterday morning to inspect the river headwaters. He never returned. The boy claims he saw riders near Arrowhead Pass early this morning dragging something large wrapped in canvas, something body-sized. The silence became absolute suffocating. Dakota's jaw tightened, muscles bunching. A corpse, or a prisoner. Most likely, Hale confirmed quietly. Either way, your promised safe talk was manufactured as bait. They never intended to honor any agreement. This was designed to lure you into town, where you could be dealt with quietly. Dorothea felt crushing weight settle over her. The town's last federal restraint had been eliminated, or soon would be. No marshal was coming, no inspector would arrive. No authority existed that mattered more than rope and willing men. Wapia looked up at her father, eyes remarkably calm, despite their circumstances. Ate, what do we do? Lakota did not answer immediately. He stared at the ledger pages, the vials, the ladder leading up to the hostile world. His mind worked through options, calculating risks against slim chances, weighing his daughter's life against everything else. Finally, he spoke. We leave tonight. We take the evidence and ride for the Lakota camp. We show the headman. We send our fastest rider with this to Fort Kearney. We create noise too loud to silence with bullets alone. They will hunt us, Dorothea stated flatly. Yes. I cannot ride fast. I will slow you considerably. Lakota looked at her with pure assessment without pity. You will ride fast enough, or you remain, and let Rourke bury you quietly. Those are the only choices. Choose. Dorothea swallowed hard, but she nodded. Hale stood brushing dust from his trousers. I will create a diversion. Lillian will assist. We can create confusion to give you a window. You will pay terribly for such help, Lakota observed. Hale smiled thinly, speaking of regrets and choices made too late. I have been paying for my silence my entire professional life. At least this time the payment will be for something that actually matters. They waited until the moon climbed higher and the town settled into uneasy quiet. Hale ascended first, moving with exaggerated caution, and eased the trapdoor open, just a crack. He listened for a full minute, heard nothing immediately threatening, and opened it wider. The clinic was dark except for moonlight through windows. Outside, silhouetted against a distant campfire, a man sat on the steps. Another leaned against the corner, his cigarette's red glow marking his position. Hale crossed to the back door and worked the bolt free as quietly as possible, metal sliding with only the softest click. He turned and gestured. Lakota climbed up smoothly, then lifted Wapia through. Dorothea came last slower, the prosthesis catching repeatedly. Lakota reached down and pulled her up firmly by the forearm. They moved to the back door and slipped into the night. The alley behind the clinic smelled of sage horse manure and night-blooming flowers. Chaska and Hanska materialized from shadows, holding ready horse reins. No words exchanged, only brief hand signals. Lillian Sigrid appeared from a side street carrying a lantern and a clinking cloth sack. She walked with deliberate loudness past the clinic's front footsteps, echoing, and called out in clear, authoritative voice. Dr. Hale, are you still awake? I have a student with sudden high fever. The man on the steps stood turning toward her. School is closed at this hour, ma'am. Come back morning. I am quite aware of the hour, Lillian replied crisply, using precisely the tone she employed correcting slow pupils. However, serious fever does not wait for convenient schedules. The diversion was paper-thin, but in that moment of divided attention, Lakota led the group silently toward the settlement's edge, keeping to darkest alleys, moving with practiced fluid silence. They had covered perhaps 50 yards, nearly reaching the last building when someone's sharp eyes caught movement. They are running south side, moving fast. Gunfire cracked sharply, loud reports echoing off buildings before scattering into darkness. A bullet whined past Dorothea's head, close enough that she felt air pressure shift. Lakota immediately spurred his horse and pulled Wapaya tight against his chest. Dorothea kicked her borrowed mare desperately, an old reluctant animal, and the horse finally lurched into grudging motion with a protesting whinny. They galloped across open ground, hooves pounding rhythmically, thick dust rising behind them. Behind riders were mounting with urgent speed, the deadly chase beginning. Rourke's distinctive voice carried clearly calm and relentless. Bring them back without fail. Alive is preferable. Dead is acceptable. They rode desperately through the long night, pushing the horses as fast as treacherous terrain allowed, without risking catastrophic injury. The moon provided cold illumination, painting the landscape in stark silver and black, every rock a potential hazard, every gully a trap. One wrong step could prove instantly fatal. Dorothea clung to her mare's mane with aching hands, the rigid prosthesis wedged awkwardly in the stirrup, sending sharp jolts up her leg with every jarring stride. She did not voice complaints. Complaining would change nothing and waste breath. Lakota led them initially eastward, deliberately away from the direct route to the Lakota camp. Leading armed men straight to his vulnerable people would invite massacre. Instead, he angled toward higher ground, a prominent ridge overlooking Copper Gulch Mine from above, where they could assess the situation and plan with better information. They reached the ridge as dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale pink. Lakota dismounted smoothly and helped Wapaya down, then turned to Dorothea. She slid off herself, gritting her teeth as impact jarred her stump viciously and sent white pain flashing. Rest briefly, Lakota commanded. We have perhaps a few minutes before they close distance. Dorothea sank onto a flat boulder, breathing hard and ragged. Her hands were blistered raw and bleeding from gripping reins for hours, and her stump was bleeding again despite repairs bandage completely soaked through. She deliberately did not look at it. Wapaya brought her a canteen without being asked, and Dorothea drank gratefully. The cold water was almost painful against her parched throat. She handed it back, and the solemn girl accepted it without speaking. Lakota moved purposefully to the ridge edge and looked down into the valley below. Copper Gulch Mine sprawled across the landscape like an infected wound, all broken earth, crude timber scaffolding, and a complex maze of wooden sluices carrying contaminated water and crushed ore downward. A sprawling camp of tents and rough shacks clustered near the main shaft, thin smoke rising from early cooking fires. Men moved between buildings, appearing small and distant as insects on carrion. Then Dorothea spotted what was happening at the sluice line, and her blood went cold. Near the camp's edge, positioned close to the largest sluice channel, several men were systematically rolling large barrels from a storage shed. Very large barrels, the distinctive type used for amalgamation waste containing mercury. They rolled them with practiced efficiency to the sluice edge and tipped them without hesitation, one after another, toxic contents pouring freely into the rushing water channel leading directly downstream to the river. The liquid that spilled out was noticeably darker than water, thicker, with that telltale mercury sheen glinting faintly in strengthening morning light. The men worked casually without urgency or concealment. This was routine, standard procedure. This poisoning had been happening systematically for months, possibly years. A young boy, perhaps 12, shoveled loose dirt over the worst spill to hide the rainbow sheen. When he paused to cough a deep, wet-racking cough that violently doubled him over, the foreman stepped forward without hesitation and struck him hard across thin shoulders with a wooden stick. The boy straightened quickly, despite still coughing, clearly accustomed to such treatment, and immediately returned to shoveling. Dorothea whispered a curse that escaped before she could stop it. Lakota said nothing. His face could have been carved from stone, but his dark eyes tracked every movement with intense predatory focus. Then a wagon appeared, approaching slowly from town along the rough trail. It was pulled by 2 mules, driven by a hunched figure in a broad hat pulled low. In the wagon bed lay a shape wrapped in filthy canvas, long, unmistakably human-sized, moving slightly, with shallow, labored breathing. Not a corpse yet. Something living, but barely. The driver stopped beside the mine office. 2 workers climbed into the bed without ceremony and dragged the wrapped bundle out roughly. They simply let it drop heavily onto hard ground with a sickening thud. And when it impacted, the canvas shifted enough to reveal one pale hand, falling free, fingers slack, wearing a federal Indian agent's distinctive brass badge still pinned prominently to the visible shirt cuff. Agent Cornelius Hale, the man who had promised safe talk and federal protection, the man who was supposed to bring an inspector and enforce law, not dead, not yet, but close. His chest rose and fell with painful, irregular movements, each breath clearly an agonizing struggle. Sheriff Victor Rourke rode up calmly alongside the wagon on his handsome bay horse coat, glossy and well-groomed. He dismounted with unhurried grace, methodically brushed trail dust from his black coat, and walked to where the canvas-wrapped bundle lay. He crouched, reached out almost gently, and pulled the gag from Agent Hale's mouth. Rourke spoke quietly at first voice, not carrying to the watchers above. Then he stood slowly and spoke much louder, deliberately pitching his voice to carry across the entire valley like a bell tolling, knowing it would reach anyone positioned on the ridges. We will find that stolen ledger. We will learn with certainty exactly who has seen it and what they know. Then Agent Hale will suffer an unfortunate accident, perhaps a tragic fall down an abandoned shaft. Nobody will ask difficult questions afterward. Nobody ever does in circumstances like these. The terrible truth crashed down with crushing weight. They had not been hunting the ledger simply to destroy evidence. They had been hunting it to identify loose ends, to learn who else possessed dangerous knowledge, who else needed permanent elimination. The agent had not been killed outright because he was more strategically useful alive, as perfect bait to draw out anyone who might have obtained evidence copies, forcing everything into the open, where threats could be systematically eliminated. Dorothea realized with cold clarity Rourke had never intended simply to arrest her. He had intended to use her as an information source through interrogation, extracting every name and detail, then erase her completely along with everyone else. And Lakota had walked directly into the carefully prepared trap the moment he sat at that table. But there was something else, something neither Dorothea nor Lakota could yet see. Hidden inside Agent Hale's canvas wrapping, pressed against his barely conscious body, was a folded document. Before his capture, the agent had managed to hide it there, a signed statement detailing everything he had learned about the mine's operations, Rourke's involvement, and the systematic corruption. He had arranged the Whiskey Bend meeting not as naive negotiation, but as a calculated gambit. He had known the risks, had suspected he might not survive, but had hoped that by drawing out the conspirators' methods and desperation, anyone would find the evidence he had secured and use it to bring them down. Agent Hale had been many things, but he had not been a fool. He had been a federal officer attempting to build an unassailable case against powerful criminals, and he had been willing to use himself as bait if necessary. The truth of his courage and sacrifice would only become clear later when the canvas was unwrapped and the hidden document discovered. Lakota turned to his two escorts and spoke rapidly in Lakota. Chaska and Hanska nodded, once checked their rifles and mounted their horses. They would ride back to the Lakota camp as fast as horses could sustain and carry detailed word to the headman. If Lakota did not return within 2 days, the people would know what happened and could decide their response. Then Lakota looked directly at Dorothea, expression absolutely serious. "We go down there now. We retrieve the agent while he still lives. We confront them with the evidence we have. We stop the dumping immediately, not later, not after more negotiation, but now. And we take the agent and ride harder than we have ever ridden straight for Fort Kearney without stopping." "That is suicide," Dorothea said, not arguing, but stating fact. "Yes, very likely. They will see us coming from considerable distance." "Not if we use the eastern approach gully I scouted. There's a narrow ravine well screened by scrub and fallen rock. I scouted it carefully 2 weeks ago when I first investigated the contamination source. The gully emerges quite close to the workers' boarding house where you used to work." Dorothea stared with newfound respect. "You scouted the mine extensively before ever coming to town." "I never walk into dangerous places without thorough reconnaissance." She almost laughed at the absurdity this man who had repaired her prosthesis, who had hidden with her in a cellar, who was now proposing to walk into an armed mining camp with nothing but rifles and desperate courage, struck her as the purest madness, indistinguishable from highest bravery. "Very well. Let us commit this suicide together." Lakota allowed himself the smallest grim smile. "Good. Stay close." They left the horses carefully hidden with Wapia in a protected rocky cleft where the girl could watch both valley and approach trail. Lakota gave her his revolver, showing her with patient care how to hold the heavy weapon, how to aim using the sights, how to pull back the hammer until it clicked firmly into firing position. Wapia accepted the responsibility without hesitation, her hands surprisingly steady. "If armed men come, and we do not return safely," Lakota said slowly and clearly, "you ride immediately without delay. Do not wait for us. Do not hesitate. Ride as fast as this horse can carry you to the camp and tell the headman every single thing you have witnessed." Wapia nodded solemnly. "I will tell him you were brave and strong, Ate. Tell him instead that I was smart and careful. Merely brave men die unnecessarily and accomplish nothing." Then he turned and led Dorothea down the steep ridge slope, moving low and fast, with practiced skill using every available rock and patch of brush for protective cover. The gully was narrow and choked with dry sage and twisted juniper. Dorothea's prosthesis caught repeatedly on exposed roots and half-buried stones, threatening to trip her with every few steps. More than once she grabbed Lakota's shoulder for necessary balance, and each time he steadied her without breaking stride. He maintained a pace just barely short of running, and she matched it because there was no alternative. They reached the camp's edge and paused behind empty ore carts. Men were still working the sluice line, systematically dumping toxic waste barrels and shoveling concealing dirt. The wagon carrying Agent Hale's wrapped body sat beside the office building, the canvas bundle still visible and occasionally moving. Rourke had gone inside, probably to drink coffee, and discussed next steps with Foreman Mercer in comfort. Lakota studied the scene with tactical precision, his mind working through options. He turned to Dorothea. "We need that document," the agent mentioned, the one he would have tried to hide if he suspected capture. If he is the man his reputation suggests, he would not have come without insurance. "Check the wagon. I will create a diversion and confront them directly with the water evidence. When chaos comes, and it will come, you must act quickly." Before Dorothea could respond, Lakota stood and walked deliberately into the open, carrying one of Dr. Hale's glass vials in his raised hand, where it caught the morning light. "Sheriff Rourke." Dakota's voice rang across the camp with commanding authority. "I have evidence of your crimes, federal evidence, and I am here to stop this poisoning immediately." Men froze mid-task, turning to stare. The camp went silent except for the sound of water rushing through sluices. Rourke emerged from the office coffee cup, still in hand expression, shifting from surprise to cold calculation. "Dakota, I thought you would have run back to your people by now. That would have been the smart choice." "I do not run from murder. Your mind poisons the river. This water," Dakota held up the vial, "proves it. Mercury contamination, deliberate, systematic. You kill my people. You kill your own people. For profit." Rourke set down his coffee cup carefully. "That is quite an accusation. Do you have any actual proof, or just dirty water and native superstition?" Dakota's expression did not change. "I have more than water. I have records, names, dates, payments to you, and I have witnesses who will testify." "Witnesses can disappear," Rourke said mildly, "as you are about to learn." He gestured and men began moving to surround Dakota. But Dakota was not watching them. He was watching the main sluice line, measuring distances, calculating angles. In that moment of distraction, Dorothea moved. She circled behind the wagon, using her knowledge of the camp's layout from her months working there. The men were focused on Dakota, the confrontation, the building tension. No one watched the crippled woman. She reached the wagon and climbed awkwardly into the bed, her prosthesis making it difficult, but not impossible. Agent Hale lay wrapped in canvas, barely conscious. His eyes flickered open as she leaned close. "The document," Dorothea whispered urgently. "Where is it?" Agent Hale's lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words almost too quiet to hear. "Inside. The wrapping. Against my chest. Use it. Stop them." Dorothea's hands worked quickly, finding the canvas folds reaching carefully inside, without disturbing the agent's injuries more than necessary. Her fingers touched paper-thick official paper folded multiple times. She extracted it carefully and tucked it immediately inside her own dress, where the ledger pages already rested. "You were trying to help us all along," she whispered. Agent Hale managed the faintest nod. "Do not let them win." Back at the sluice line, the confrontation was escalating. Rourke had signaled his men to close in, but Dakota suddenly lunged not toward the men, but toward the main sluice valve, a wooden gate mechanism that controlled flow. He reached it before anyone could react and grabbed the lever. "You want proof," Dakota shouted. "Watch what happens when the truth flows backward." He threw his full weight against the lever muscles, straining. The mechanism was designed to be operated by two men with tools. But Dakota's desperate strength and the lever's mechanical advantage proved sufficient. With a grinding screech of wood on wood, the valve began to turn. The sluice flow slowed, then stopped as Dakota continued forcing the mechanism past its normal range, began to reverse backing up, flooding the area around the dumping station. Mercury-laden water and amalgamation waste that should have been flowing downstream toward the river instead spread across the processing area, pooling around the toxic waste barrels, creating a shimmering, undeniable testament to contamination. Workers shouted in alarm and confusion, backing away from the spreading, silver-sheened water. Some began coughing as vapors rose. The evidence was literally spilling across the ground for everyone to see. "Look at it," Dakota shouted to the gathered workers. "This is what flows to the river every day. This is what kills your children. This is what they pay Rourke to ignore." For a crucial moment, the workers hesitated. They could see the mercury gleaming in pooled water. They could smell the metallic tang. Many of them had children who were sick. wives who suffered tremors and confusion. Their own hands shook when they tried to hold a cup steady. The moment of collective realization could have changed everything, but Rourke moved quickly to regain control. "He is sabotaging company property. He is an Indian radical trying to shut down the mine that feeds your families. Stop him." Deputy Fritz raised his rifle, aiming at Lakota. But before he could fire a shot, rang out from an entirely different direction. Wapia, watching from the ridge, had seen her father in mortal danger. The 9-year-old girl had climbed onto a high rock to get a better angle, aimed the heavy revolver with both small hands, exactly as her father had shown her, and fired. The shot was not meant to kill the girl, aimed high deliberately. But the bullet struck the wooden framework above the sluice line, sending splinters flying. Men ducked instinctively. In the moment of confusion, Lakota released the lever and dove behind the ore carts where Dorothea was already positioned. "Did you find it?" he asked urgently. "Yes." Agent Hale hid documentation inside his wrapping. "I have it." "Then we run. Now." But as they started to move, an explosion shattered the morning. The blast line triggered not by accident, but by deliberate command. Mercer, seeing his operation exposed and his profits threatened, had given the order to collapse the area where Lakota had been standing, intending to bury the evidence and the witnesses simultaneously. The explosion was catastrophic, not beautiful or cinematic, but pure destructive force that slammed into everyone like an invisible wall. The sound was deafening, a physical assault that left ears ringing and balance destroyed. Choking dust filled the air, instantly turning day into twilight. Splintered timber rained down like deadly hail. The tunnel mouth vomited rubble and shattered support beams with a sustained roar that shook the very ground. Dorothea was thrown off her feet completely. She hit the ground hard, prosthesis torn partly loose by the impact. When she could see through the dust, she spotted Lakota. But he was down, blood spreading from his shoulder where a jagged piece of flying timber had struck him like a spear. 3 of Mercer's hired guns appeared through the chaos, moving with the coordination of professional killers. They were not interested in capture anymore. They raised rifles toward Lakota's prone form. "No!" Dorothea's scream cut through the aftermath noise. She moved without conscious thought, driven by something deeper than rational decision. She could not fight 3 armed men. She could not even run effectively. But she could act. Using her knowledge of the mine, the layout burned into her memory from months of forced labor. She grabbed Lakota under the arms and began dragging him backward with desperate strength that should have been impossible. The prosthesis slipped and failed, but she kept moving using her arms and her one good leg, pulling his substantial weight inch by agonizing inch. "The tunnel," she gasped. "Old exploratory tunnel behind the collapsed framework. I know it. I worked this area. There is a way through." Lakota was conscious, but dazed, blood loss making his movements weak. "Leave me. Take the documents. Run." "I asked to share your table," Dorothea said through gritted teeth, still pulling. "You said yes. That means I do not leave you to die. Now help me, or we both die here." Her words, throwing his own earlier statement back at him, penetrated the fog of shock. Lakota gathered himself and managed to get his feet under him, partially taking some of his own weight. Together they stumbled toward the area Dorothea had indicated. The 3 gunmen recovered from the blast's disorientation and gave chase, firing as they came. Bullets kicked up dirt around the fleeing pair. One struck a rock near Dorothea's head, spraying stone fragments. They reached what looked like a solid wall of collapsed timbers, but Dorothea knew better. She pulled aside specific boards, an old emergency exit from the excavation days never officially recorded, known only to workers who had labored in these shafts. Behind the carefully arranged camouflage was a narrow opening into darkness. Inside, she commanded, pushing Dakota ahead of her. He squeezed through, and she followed, pulling the camouflaging boards back into place behind them, just as the gunman reached the spot. From outside, it would look like solid wall. The killers would lose precious seconds searching. Inside, the tunnel was pitch black and cold. Water trickled somewhere nearby. The smell of damp earth and old timber filled their noses. "Can you walk?" Dorothea whispered. "I can do what is necessary." Dakota replied, echoing her earlier words. They moved deeper, Dorothea, leading now by memory and touch. She had been in these old exploratory tunnels before during her time as a worker, when she had to retrieve supplies stored in dry sections. She knew this warren of passages had multiple exits if they could reach them before the men found the entrance, or before something worse happened. Behind them, they heard shouts. The gunmen had found the opening. Lantern light began to glow faintly in the darkness behind them, growing stronger. Then they heard something else, a sound that made Dorothea's blood run cold. Water. Rushing water growing louder with terrifying speed. "They are flooding it," she realized with horror. "They have opened the barrier to the right tunnel, the one with the underground spring. They are going to drown us." The reality of their situation crystallized in an instant. They could not go back that way, lay armed men. They could not stay, the water would overtake them. Their only option was forward, hoping desperately that the exit Dorothea remembered still existed and was not blocked after years of neglect. The water reached them with shocking speed, first around their ankles, then rising to their knees, then waist-deep within minutes as the tunnel floor descended and the flood found its level. Dakota's wounded shoulder made swimming difficult. The cold water shocked his system and blood loss was making him weaker. Dorothea's prosthesis, already damaged, became a deadly liability in the water. The leather straps loosened as they became saturated. The wooden leg threatened to float, throwing off her balance dangerously. "It is not going to work." Dorothea gasped, struggling against the current that was now strong enough to pull at them. "I am slowing you down. Take the documents and go. I will hold them off as long as I can." Dakota stopped and turned to face her, water swirling around them, both the faint light of their pursuers' lanterns reflecting off the rising flood. His expression was fierce despite his weakness. "You asked to share my table. I said yes. That means I will not abandon you to die alone in darkness. Now move." The simple power of his words. Not romance, not declarations of feeling, but a fundamental statement of honor and chosen obligation gave Dorothea strength she did not know she possessed. She pushed forward. The water reached their chests. Dorothea made a critical decision. She stopped, unbuckled the prosthesis straps with frantic fingers, and abandoned the wooden leg to the water. Using only her arms and her remaining leg, she began to swim-crawl forward with desperate determination. Dakota stayed close beside her, helping when he could. Despite his wounded shoulder, their survival now completely interdependent. "There," Dorothea shouted, seeing a faint gray square ahead, light from outside, however dim. The exit she remembered, but it was partially blocked by an old collapsed section of timber and rock. Behind them, their pursuers were being driven back by the flood they had unleashed, realizing too late that the water would claim everyone in the tunnel system indiscriminately. Dakota and Dorothea reached the partial collapse. The opening was small, barely wide enough for one person. Sharp rocks tore at their clothes and skin as they squeezed through. Dakota went first, dragging himself through the narrow gap with excruciating effort, then immediately turned to help pull Dorothea through from the other side. She emerged onto a steep riverbank, the tunnel exiting directly above a churning gorge. Behind them, the tunnel belched a final surge of contaminated water and debris before the entire section collapsed with a thunderous roar that seemed to go on forever. Tons of rock and earth came down, sealing the passage completely. If anyone else had been in those tunnels when the collapse came, they were entombed permanently. Rourke's fate remained uncertain in that moment, whether he had entered the tunnels himself to ensure his victims' deaths or whether he had remained outside to coordinate. The answer would become clear only when the survivors could be counted. Dakota and Dorothea lay on the rocks, too exhausted to move, too grateful to be alive, to care about anything else immediately. Dakota's shoulder wound bled steadily. Dorothea's stump was raw and damaged from the desperate swim. Neither had strength left to continue. Then voices reached them, calling, searching. Dr. Edwin Hale appeared first, scrambling down the gorge bank, with medical bag bouncing against his hip. Lily and Sigrid followed close behind. They had tracked the sounds of the explosion and collapse, following the commotion and the cloud of dust visible from town. Great heavens! Dr. Hale breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. He began examining Dakota's shoulder wound with professional efficiency, despite trembling hands. Timber penetration. Deep but clean, missed major vessels. You are incredibly fortunate. He turned to Dorothea. Your leg. Gone again, she said flatly. In the tunnel. Abandoned. Lillian wrapped blankets around both of them, her severe face transformed by genuine concern and something like awe. You are both alive. Against all odds, you are alive. The agent, Dorothea gasped, suddenly remembering. In the wagon, is he alive? Lillian confirmed. Barely, but alive. Some of the miners, the ones with sick children, they turned against Rourke when they saw what you exposed. They pulled the agent free and brought him to safety. He is in Dr. Hale's clinic now, receiving care. And Rourke? Dakota asked through clenched teeth as the doctor began cleaning his wound. Dead, came a small, strong voice from above. Wapia scrambled down the slope with impressive agility, still clutching her father's revolver in one hand. In her other hand, she held a single folded piece of paper, pristine and undamaged, kept safe while chaos reigned below. She threw herself at Dakota with fierce intensity, careful of his wounded shoulder, and he caught her with his good arm. What happened, little one? He asked softly. After you went into the tunnel, there was fighting at the mine. The workers were angry. They saw the mercury, they understood what it meant. Rourke tried to run, but he went into the tunnels, the wrong tunnels, before anyone could warn him the flood was coming. Some of his own men had opened the water barrier to drown you, but it drowned him instead. The miners say he is buried under all that rock now, dead and gone. Poetic justice, perhaps. Rourke had died in the very trap he had set for others, killed by the same ruthless efficiency he had employed throughout his corrupt career. And this, Wapia continued, holding up the paper with pride. I kept safe. The receipt that shows what the bad sheriff bought. The poison, with his name written clear. Dakota took the paper with something like reverence, unfolding it despite his shaking hands. Rourke's signature was clear and undeniable. The purchase order for river treatment supplies, mercury by any honest reading explicit and damning. Dr. Hale looked at it and exhaled slowly. Combined with Agent Hale's hidden documentation that Miss Schmidt retrieved, plus my medical records, Lillian's testimonies, and the physical evidence you exposed at the mine. This is sufficient. More than sufficient. Sufficient for what? Dorothea asked quietly. For justice, for closure, for the beginning of healing. Dr. Hale worked on Dakota's shoulder with steady hands, cleaning and binding the wound properly. The timber had penetrated deep, but had by fortune missed major blood vessels and bone. With proper care and time, it would heal completely. For Dorothea, he could do little immediately, except clean and rebandage her damaged stump. I will need time to craft you a proper prosthesis, he said gently. One designed correctly from the start. better than anything you have had before. But for now, you will need to use crutches and accept help." "I have been accepting help," Dorothea said, looking at Dakota. "I am learning that accepting help is not weakness. It is wisdom." Lillian helped both of them to their feet, or in Dorothea's case, to her foot in crutches improvised from tree branches. Together, they began the slow journey back to town. As they walked, Lillian explained what had happened after the confrontation at the mine. The workers, many of whom had been complicit through silence or fear, had finally been pushed beyond their breaking point. Seeing the mercury pooled and undeniable understanding that their children's suffering had a cause and a culprit, they had turned. Not all of them, some had fled with Mercer, who had escaped in the chaos. But enough had turned to make a difference. The mine was shut down now, not by official order, but by the workers themselves who refused to continue. The sluices had been damaged in the explosion and collapse. Production had stopped, and most importantly, word was spreading. Riders had been sent to Fort Kearny, to the territorial capital, to anyone who might listen. The story was getting out, carried by too many voices to be silenced. They returned to Whiskey Bend, to find the town transformed by uncertainty and fear, not of Indians or outsiders, but of consequences. The comfortable corruption that had sustained the settlement was crumbling, and nobody knew what would replace it. Marshal Samuel Frost arrived 4 days later, riding in with a federal inspector and a small military escort. The marshal was gray-haired and competent-looking, carrying the kind of authority that could not be bought or intimidated. We received a preliminary report from Agent Hale before his capture. Marshal Frost explained standing in Dr. Hale's clinic, where the agent was recovering slowly but steadily. When he failed to report back on schedule, we came to investigate. It appears we are somewhat late to the actual crisis, but not too late for justice. Agent Cornelius Hale, still weak but conscious and lucid, smiled faintly from his bed. "Not late, Marshal. Perfectly timed. The real work was done by people far braver than any federal agent." He gestured weakly toward Dorothea, sitting in a chair with her bandaged stump elevated. Toward Dakota, standing by the window, with his arm in a sling wapia at his side. Toward Dr. Hale and Lillian, who had risked everything to stand with strangers against power. These people stopped the poisoning. They exposed corruption. They faced down violence with nothing but truth and courage. I was merely attempting to catch up to what they had already accomplished. Marshal Frost studied the assembled group with genuine respect. Then, on behalf of the federal government and the territory, I thank you all. The mine will be closed pending complete inquiry and cleanup work. Criminal charges will be filed against Foreman Mercer and any surviving conspirators we can locate. The river will be cleaned as thoroughly as the best methods available allow, and all workers will be released from debt contracts immediately and without prejudice. He turned specifically to Dorothea. "Miss Schmidt, you are listed as a protected federal witness. You owe nothing to anyone. You are free to go wherever you choose." Dorothea looked at Dakota, who met her gaze steadily. The unspoken question hung between them. Before either could speak, Agent Hale raised one weak hand. "There is more you should all know about why I arranged the meeting at Whiskey Bend the way I did." Everyone turned to listen. I suspected corruption at the highest local levels for months. Agent Hale explained, his voice still weak but gaining strength as he spoke. But suspicion is not proof, and Rourke was careful. I needed to force them to act desperately to expose themselves. So I arranged the meeting, knowing it was likely a trap, knowing they might capture me. He paused, breathing carefully. I hid documentation inside my clothing before I rode out that day. I gambled that if I was taken, someone else, someone brave enough and smart enough, would find it and use it. I gambled that my capture would draw out the full extent of their operation, make them desperate enough to act openly, where they could be witnessed and stopped. Dorothea stared at him. You used yourself as bait. Deliberately. I did my duty as a federal officer. I attempted to build an unassailable case against criminals who were killing innocent people for profit. I was willing to risk my life for that. He smiled faintly, though I admit I had hoped to survive the experience with somewhat less injury. You are a brave man, Lakota said quietly. You honor your position. No braver than any of you, Agent Hale replied. You had far less protection, far less authority, and far more to lose. Yet you acted anyway. That is courage in its purest form. Over the following weeks, as summer deepened into early autumn, Whiskey Bend underwent painful transformation. Mercer was captured 3 days' ride south, attempting to flee to Mexico. He was returned to face federal charges. His testimony, given in exchange for leniency, exposed the full network of corruption and provided names of officials in multiple territories who had been accepting bribes to ignore illegal dumping violations. The mine remained closed. Federal engineers examined the river and implemented cleaning procedures, though they warned that complete cleanup work would take years, perhaps decades. Some damage would never fully heal. But the dumping had stopped, and that was a beginning. Dr. Edwin Hale worked for 3 weeks on a new prosthesis for Dorothea, the finest piece of medical craftsmanship he had ever attempted. He consulted with Lakota and with Lakota craftsmen from the camp who understood working with leather and wood in ways Eastern medical training never covered. The result was a prosthesis that fit properly, moved naturally, and caused minimal pain. When he finally fitted it to Dorothea's stump, adjusted the straps with infinite care, and helped her stand, she took her first step and actually smiled, the first genuine smile many had seen from her in months. It does not hurt, she said wonderingly, taking another step and then another. It should not, Dr. Hale replied with quiet satisfaction. You have endured quite enough pain. Time for healing now. The day they prepared to leave for the Lakota camp, a surprising number of townspeople turned out to watch, some with resentment at their comfortable corruption being disrupted, some with confusion about what came next, but many with a grudging respect they could not quite articulate. Lillian Sigrid pressed a package into Dorothea's hands. Books for teaching. The children will need to learn both languages, both worlds, if there is to be any hope of lasting peace. You can help build that bridge. Dr. Hale handed Lakota a sealed medical kit for emergencies. And please tell your healers that I would be honored to learn from their knowledge, if they would permit an exchange of understanding. Marshal Frost approached with a document. This is an official federal safe conduct pass countersigned by the territorial governor. It guarantees Miss Schmidt's protection and freedom of movement. She can live where she chooses, work as she chooses. She is no longer property of anyone or anything. He handed Dorothea the paper, then turned to Lakota. The federal government recognizes what you did here. You may have saved more lives than we can count, both native and settler. That matters. It will be remembered. Lakota accepted the words with a slight nod, but his attention was on Dorothea, who stood studying the safe conduct pass with an expression mixing hope and uncertainty. The river camp has need of someone who can read, write, and keep accurate records. Lakota said quietly, someone who understands how white authorities think and operate. Someone who will not be intimidated by men with documents and official seals. Someone who has already proven they will stand and fight rather than run or surrender. I have no experience with tribal customs, Dorothea said carefully. I would be an outsider. You will learn, My people learned your customs to survive in your world. You can learn ours. It will not be easy. You will never fully belong, but you will have a place earned through courage and stubbornness. That is more than most can claim. Wapia took Dorothea's hand, without asking permission, her small fingers wrapping around scarred adult ones with surprising strength and certainty. "We will teach you," the girl said simply. "You taught us about courage in your world. We will teach you about survival in ours. And I will teach you our language, and you will teach me more English, and we will both teach other children. Maybe someday there will be more understanding and less fighting." Looking at this solemn, fierce child, who had fired a gun to save her father, who had preserved vital evidence while chaos raged, who now offered friendship and purpose with such directness, Dorothea felt something shift inside her chest. "I am still frightened," she admitted quietly. Lakota nodded with complete understanding. "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes, and you are choosing to act anyway. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Fear without paralysis is the mark of someone who will survive." Dorothea looked down at her new prosthesis, at the books Lillian had given her, at the safe conduct pass, promising freedom she had almost forgotten existed. She thought about the woman who had asked to share a table and the man who had said yes when everyone else said no. She thought about survival and courage and the strange bonds forged in desperate circumstances. "Then I choose to act," she said. "I choose to come with you. I choose to help build something better than what was." They mounted horses, Lakota, moving carefully with his healing shoulder, Dorothea managing with her new prosthesis that made mounting actually possible, rather than an exercise in agony and humiliation. Wapia rode with her father, settled securely in front of him. As they prepared to ride out, Lakota looked back at the eating house where everything had begun. The building looked the same, weathered, smoke-stained, unremarkable. But what had happened within those walls had changed lives irrevocably. "Can I share this table you can sit? My father does not eat with cowards." Everything that followed the flight, the confrontation, the flood, the desperate struggle for survival, had grown from that single moment of defiant compassion in a room full of people who had wanted them erased. They rode west toward the river, and behind them, Whiskey Bend began the slow, painful work of becoming something better than what it had been. The river ran clean again. Not perfectly clean. Some damage would never fully heal. Some mercury remained deep in sediment where it would persist for decades. But clean enough that fish returned in healthy numbers, that horses drank without fear, that children played in the shallows under watchful eyes, without falling sick afterward. Dorothea stood on the bank, watching those children splash and laugh with the unself-conscious joy of young ones who had never known the fear their slightly older siblings remembered. Her hair had grown longer, woven now in a single braid in the Lakota style, but with a distinctive blue ribbon woven through it, a blend of cultures, a visible symbol of bridging. Her prosthesis was on its fourth iteration, each version better than the last, incorporating both Dr. Hale's medical knowledge and the practical wisdom of Lakota craftsmen who had learned to work with wood and leather in ways Eastern doctors never imagined. She worked as teacher and record keeper for the camp, teaching English and arithmetic to children who needed to navigate both worlds while simultaneously learning Lakota language and customs from elders who had decided she was worth a considerable effort of instruction. It was not easy. She would never fully belong, would always be somewhat apart, neither fully white nor fully Lakota, but something in between. But she had earned a place through that desperate night, and its aftermath had proven herself through survival and stubbornness and absolute refusal to quit. Wapia, now 12 and growing tall, stood beside her, effortlessly translating a conversation between Dorothea and some of the elder women about medicinal plants and their proper preparation. The girl moved easily between worlds belonging fully to both a living bridge built of courage, adaptability, and natural diplomatic instincts that suggested a remarkable future. Dakota approached from the camp, walking with the same quiet confidence he had carried into that eating house 3 years before. His shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a scar he rarely bothered to cover. He had led 6 more delegations to meet with federal officials using Agent Hale's sacrifice, and the evidence Dorothea had preserved as leverage to force real lasting change, cleaner mining practices throughout the territory, enforced regulations with teeth, meaningful protection for tribal lands and waters, and most importantly, the precedent that crimes of poisoning the river would be prosecuted. Dr. Hale sent a message through the supply trader. Dakota reported. The railroad inspector's final report has been filed with the territorial government. Copper Gulch Mine will remain permanently closed. The land must be cleared and made safe before any future use is permitted. And the governor has created a new permanent position and territorial inspector specifically tasked with preventing this from happening elsewhere in the territory. One position, Dorothea observed. To cover how much territory, too much, Dakota acknowledged honestly. The territory is vast and one man cannot be everywhere. But it is more than existed before. Change happens slowly, one small, difficult step at a time. We proved it can happen. Others will build on what we began. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the clean water flow past, listening to the happy sounds of playing children. They had never become romantic partners. That had never been what this was about, what they needed from each other. The attraction between them was of respect, of shared survival, of mutual recognition, rather than romantic feeling. But they had become something perhaps rarer and more valuable, true partners, in purpose witnesses to each other's courage, living proof that the worst circumstances could bring out the best in people who refused to surrender to fear or hatred. Near the water's edge, a Lakota stoneworker was putting finishing touches on a large flat stone that would be planted permanently at this spot, at the place where the poisoning had been stopped, where ordinary people had chosen to fight rather than accept. Slow death. Dorothea walked closer to see the completed carving, her new prosthesis, allowing her to move across uneven ground with relative ease. 3 names had been carefully chiseled in both English and Lakota script, and below the names, a simple phrase carved with equal care in both languages. They chose courage over comfort. They chose truth over safety. They chose each other over fear. Remember their names. Honor their choice. It was not heroic legend or romanticized myth. It was simply truth, a marker of fact, a reminder for future generations who would drink from this clean river and never know how close it had come to permanent death, how close their entire people had come to being slowly poisoned into extinction or forced removal. Wapia joined them at the stone, studying the carving with the serious attention she gave to everything important. Is it enough, Ate, what we did? Does it matter enough? Dakota considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not offering easy comfort, but honest assessment. We stopped the poisoning in this place. There will be other places, other poisons, other people who choose profit over life. Evil does not end because we defeated it once, but we proved it can be stopped. We proved that ordinary people without power or position or wealth can still fight back and win if they refuse to surrender, if they stand together, if they choose courage over fear. That knowledge spreads. Others will remember. Others will act. That is not nothing. That is everything, Dorothea corrected quietly. That is the only thing that ever really matters, the proof that resistance is possible, that courage exists, that one person's choice to act can change everything. They stood together at the river's edge as the sun set over the mountains, 3 people who had shared a table when the world said no, who had fought together when wisdom said run, who had survived together when death seemed certain, and who had built something new from the ruins of corruption. The stone would remain there for generations, weathered by time, but readable, still marking the place where a question was asked and answered. Can I share this table? Yes. Sit with us. We do not abandon those who refuse to surrender to fear or injustice. And everything that came after the courage, the desperate flight, the confrontation, the struggle, the survival, the victory, the healing was born. From that single moment of choosing compassion and solidarity over hatred in a room full of people who wanted them both erased. The river flowed clean. The children played safely. The poison had been stopped. And 3 names carved in stone promised that their choice, their courage, their refusal to accept injustice would be remembered long after they themselves returned to the earth. It was enough. It was everything.